Hi, everyone. Welcome to Foresight Institute's Existential Hope Podcast. I'm really delighted to have Gilliam here with us today. Thank you so much for joining. You are quite a prolific writer, really interesting stuff, really deep dives, especially on how 20th century R&D kind of operated. And we just published another podcast episode where we were looking into the past to look into the future. And I think you're doing that at a level where it's quite detailed and useful. Actually, it's not just broad strokes conclusions, but you really dig in there. You're also an associate now at Renfrew and still a fellow at Good Science. I'm not sure, but at least you work.
Both.
Cool. Yeah, Good Science is another really fantastic project that we're big fans of at Foresight and that we have also touched on at a previous podcast. So if people are interested more in that, there's a lot more content out on all of this. But we met because I think through X, literally through an XDM, and we're just okay, let's have a call, let's say hi. And rather than just beating around the bush, telling each other what our orgs are working on, or just what we're writing about or thinking about, you immediately asked me about a very concrete problem that we have, and then proceeded for the remainder of the 25 minutes to try to solve it. And so that was one of the more unusual and productive calls I think I've ever had as an intro call. So thanks for that. And also no pressure on this conversation now, but let's try to get into some concrete nitty-bitty stuff about how we could improve just operating systems of orgs, perhaps even just of societies in a way where we can make progress happen in a useful way. Again, possibly. Okay, so maybe you just take us on a little ride. Perhaps you can describe where you got to, what you're writing about today, and what you're focused on day to day, really.
Yeah, so I came to be doing whatever it is I do right now, quite randomly, it would seem to most people. During undergrad, I was a political science major at Stanford, and I did as much computer science as I could. And I was very excited by all things R&D, computer science, normal science. I wasn't very good at it, though. It was more just a group of people I admired a lot. And I didn't really think about it beyond I'd read books here and there. My first job after college was with Steve Levitt, the Freakonomics economist at U Chicago. And he was running something of a think-do tank. And it wasn't really related to this in any capacity. But at one point, he came in with a science-related idea one day. And he said, oh, what would a Manhattan Project for X look like? And I didn't really know. And I randomly went and I picked up Richard Rhodes' Making of the Atomic Bomb. And I was enthralled. I loved it. But I didn't know that my life would be different from that point, at least my professional life, because in reality, I read it and I said, oh, I've always had a good nonfiction reading habit. I read a lot of dense social science applied micro papers before. But once I had a job, I said, oh, I kind of like nonfiction that reads like fiction. I don't really enjoy reading. I didn't grow up reading. It's a bit of a labor for me. So I like picking up practical details. That's what kind of pushes me to go do it. And just for a year or 2 years, I would just read about essentially biographies of all these dead guys with a shocking amount of divorces. Yeah. I would read their biographies, or the way I get curious is I would go look up their oral histories, and I'd say, oh, that's a weird interaction. I wonder if is there a sociology or economics literature on that? And it was purely a hobby until at one point it dawned on me. I lived in Chicago. I wasn't in the West Coast sphere as much, other than my undergrad friends. And I thought it was cool that people were spinning up FROs, or something called the ARC Institute was coming to exist. And if I'd see some blogs or things on history relevant to them, and I didn't think the blogs were very good. And that's just what happens sometimes in your area. Somebody says something and they write about your area in the New York Times, and you gripe to yourself. You're oh, I think they got that wrong. And I did that to one of my Bay Area friends on the phone, just complaining, nothing productive. And he said, no, you don't understand. People like Patrick Collison read these blogs. Maybe you're wrong, and you're wrong for reasons you don't know, but throw your hat in the ring. And so essentially I said, I'll write 5 pieces and I'll see where it goes. And here we are. When I started the Substack, it's called FreakTakes. The goal was I would like one new science organization or something of that sort one time to do one thing differently because of something I wrote, because it felt so far. And it ended up going quite well. And it turned out the Institute for Progress people, or people like Stuart Buck at the Good Science Project, saw my stuff quite quickly and they thought it was useful. And I think within 3 months of starting, I was already starting the Substack. I was already a part-time fellow at Good Science Project. And from there, it's just scaled. And I don't view the goal of the Substack as to get Noah Smith, Matt Iglesias numbers of readers. Those guys are great. I can't do what they do. Really, it was just, I want to be essential to somebody like Adam Marblestone, who you've also had on the podcast, or Tom Khalil, who now is my employer at Renaissance Philanthropy. So it's very arbitrary, and I guess being really nerdy about one particular thing and not thinking a lot about professional stability or something helped. I just threw myself into it because I liked it. And it turned out history departments don't care about this area.
You know if any org did anything differently already because of what you wrote?
So I struggle to point at one. Yes, not things I would want to claim credit for in public, though. But there's definitely been some small things where I'm like, I've expanded the ambition, but there's definitely minor things, and only history will tell if they turn out to be not minor. But there's been quite a few minor things, and in the beginning, all I ever hoped for was minor things. Things like, hey, you're like an ambitious applied R&D operation. It seems to me like Bell Labs systems engineers were like the best systematized way to make sure you're like triaging the right questions and know you're not wasting money. And it's something where there's a market that VCs wouldn't want to touch. And when you go talk to them, if you talk to orgs like this early on, they'll often be like, oh, you're right. That's just a very good idea. And we're just going to put this responsibility onto a person we have on the team. But I wouldn't want to take credit for any of them, because often if they're really late, you can't really convince them. And if they're really early, they're having all sorts of discovery calls. And you could say, oh, maybe somebody else had that idea. And I am mainly just excited that people are there to be convinced and that they find history useful and applied.
Yeah, could you share a little bit more info about the specific Bell Labs example? I know that that's one that you've really taken apart.
Oh, yeah. So where the Bell Labs piece came from is, so I, every so often, will go write a piece and say, I think people will use this, it'll be great. But in reality, I view the whole like FreakTakes as an applied research shop. So I try to get out there and talk to people who are building new science orgs to just understand, like, where are you there to be convinced on? And one of the orgs that was spinning up adjacent to Convergent Research, or under their umbrella, I forget precisely which, essentially they said, it's our sense that like Bell Labs used to do X, and that they would show people this booklet about how the telephone system worked, and that's how you get the term target-rich environment seems popular in the West Coast. And I'd read a modest amount of Bell Labs history, and like I'd maybe seen the book mentioned one time or something. It just didn't really come up. So on the call, I said, you're there to be convinced. If I wrote something up for you in the next month, you would like use it, incorporate it into like how you set up your management structure. And it was early days, and they said, yes, this would be very useful. And it turns out, so Bell Labs, people consider this bastion of, oh, it was academic freedom. You did whatever you want in like a corporate setting. That's not precisely true. A lot of orgs like Bell Labs or like early GE research, they exercise this principle in management, which I call long leash within a narrow fence, which is they want to give you the room to work on something for 3 years, but they're going to try to find a way to bound you in some way. So at early GE, I'll do early GE research and then talk about Bell Labs. At early GE research, when they hired somebody like Irvin Langmuir, who ended up going on to win the Nobel Prize in surface chemistry, they brought him in from the Stevens Institute. He was like a pretty applied guy, but a basic researcher. And they said, you could work on anything you want, which is what people think places like Bell Labs did, ... conditional on it's solving a problem that's going on over there on the applied side of the lab, on the engineering side of the lab. And so when somebody like Langmuir goes over there, you find all sorts of problems in terms of, hey, your bulb is lit right now. And they're like, yeah. And then he like names the circumstances and why the literature says it shouldn't be able to stay lit in this environment. And the engineers put their thumbs up and they go, it's lit. We don't really know what to tell you. And that's the kind of thing where he goes, oh, there's like a hole in the literature. And Langmuir, on some of his more extended investigations, might spend 3 years just conducting very thorough courses of experiment, like putting different gases into the bulbs or like different vacuum environments to just understand how they're working and build up a theory. And Bell Labs did a good job of professionalizing this. They said, we're a much bigger operation. We're huge. We're not going to have you all walk to the other side of the lab. This is much too big. What we have is about 10% of our headcount or something like that. Forgive me if I'm wrong. It'll be correct on my Substack. About 10% of our headcount who are good physicists, good engineers, good chemists, whatever, and maybe not top tier, and also maybe could have been consultants in another life, or the kind of people who are like founders today. They're very practical. And you'd have those people go and tour Bell's manufacturing operations, or pore over Bell's budgets to understand like where they're having problems and the market sizes of those problems. And one of the most profitable problems that Bell Labs ever uncovered came from one of these systems engineers who it's their job to know that side of the practical operation and also walk around Bell Labs and the basic researchers and know who's doing what, who's interested in what. One problem they brought to the metallurgist one day essentially said, oh, we have these poles that degrade at this rate in this environment, and it's something like on the order of $100 million a year repair budget for us. Anything the metallurgists can rig up to solve this problem, this is $1 billion problem for the company over a 10 or 20 year period. And then once you know it's $1 billion, all of a sudden it gets quite easy for Bell Telephone on paper to say, yeah, we have, I don't know how many people were on it, 3 people, 8 people, 15 people, like all focused on rigging up this one material to do this one thing and like really doing fundamental research investigations to look into it just because it's such a big problem. And you have the freedom to do that and know you're doing a good job when you've scoped problems accordingly, know the market size and all of that. And so to me, if I was a new science org, a Bell Labs flavored systems engineer has a place in almost all of them. And if you say, oh, our research doesn't need to be useful for 20 years, like that's fantastic. In that case, like the markets that are interesting to your systems engineer, like really expand. But it's very useful, I think, to a lot of the history of American applied R&D does use people like systems engineers or market signals in some way to dictate the work in some fashion.
But doesn't it even seem more impactful to know where to even draw the fence around before you do the long leash? Like basically isn't like the type of problem that, or like the types of problem area that you allow someone to solve within, isn't that like super impactful for just the impact of the solution that you get? So arguably you want a lot of thought to put into what problem even to have these people focus on if they're actually spending a good chunk of the budget, or like what problem area, what fenced off area do you allow them to have a long leash on, rather than just saying, yeah.
So are you saying it's bad to have the systems engineer drawing the fence because you're artificially limiting things? Or are you saying, what precisely are you saying? Sorry, yeah. And then I'll answer.
Okay, I thought that basically Bell Labs was giving them like a fence of an area. Basically, they couldn't just pick any problem at random. They had to pick a problem within a specific area. And then they were able to like totally have a long leash on what they want to pick and how to solve it. But arguably isn't also like the meta problem to solve and like what to even focus on in terms of like where to draw the fence around. Isn't that also a large problem?
I guess something to remember is the systems engineer was not necessarily dictating to them top down what they can work on. Probably like maybe half their time. I'd have to look precisely into the numbers. They spent, let's say, half their time or brain power going and walking Bell Labs itself to know what people are working on. And I guess the way a Bell Labs budget would work would be different than a lot of corporate budgets today, where you can't run like a single experiment without the company signing off. They were pretty loosey-goosey on like budgets below a certain point. So you had a lot of like people fiddling on really cheap like crackpot projects or ideas, or like taking stuff home to work on it. This is just like the nature of, let's say, like engineering firms in 1950, or like something like Draper Lab, where even though they were doing very classified stuff, the lab had this almost formal process of we don't ask questions when the equipment disappears for 4 days at a time, because that's where like the new exciting stuff comes from. So I think given the systems engineer is going and talking with those guys all the time, who a lot of times are technically more brilliant than the systems engineer might be, and like the systems engineer might be a chemist themselves, the whole thing is an ongoing process. And if somebody's really convinced something is good on the Bell Labs end, you could imagine them also pushing the systems engineer to look into the practicalities to find ways to make it profitable. But also, it's not a perfect system. Like, to be very clear, one of the side projects that Bell Labs was not working on was Claude Shannon was doing his information theory stuff in his, I believe it would have been in his Manhattan apartment. So it was a really great theoretical problem that came out of the applied work he did day to day at Bell Labs, but they missed that one, I think. I'd have to, maybe I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure they missed that one. And they probably felt a little guilty about it. So like when people talk about Claude Shannon, like doing whatever he wanted at Bell Labs, that was after he figured the information theory stuff out. And they gave him borderline emeritus status because it was worth so much to the firm. But like weren't really properly funding him to work on it. And so you do miss. So if you're going to say it seems like you're going to miss maybe the most exciting thing that could come out of the labs with this process, I think you'd be right in that. But if somebody wanted to counter you, they could also say, it seems like Claude Shannon had two massive discoveries in his life. There was like his master's thesis, which he figured out while working as like a very practical person on Vannevar Bush's differential analyzer project. And that's where we get like Boolean algebra applied to like computers. And then also maybe Bell was underemploying him on this stuff, but that was when we got information theory out of him. And the second he gets Bell Labs emeritus status or leaves and does a lot of juggling and unicycling at MIT, we're not getting the same practical outputs out of him, because what he spends a lot of, Jimmy Sonny's book is actually very great on talking about the frittering parts of Claude Shannon's life. Is he seems like he's still quite brilliant, but he's figuring out ways to mathematically describe random things he's up to, playing cards or things of that sort. So I think the Claude Shannon story is a really complicated one, but it's very interesting because I think a lot of people who disagree with each other on applied and basic research have a lot of things where they can feel right, but things they have to acknowledge wouldn't have happened with their pure applied or pure basic system.
Okay, super interesting. And do you have any other example apart from Bell Labs that you like to draw people's attention to, like basically, or I guess even on a more meta level? Like when you talk to other organizations, do you usually have a go-to like list of here's a few really interesting historic examples that probably most research organizations or most organizations could learn from? Or is it more you talk to an org, you figure out what their problem is, and then you're like, where in the history of scientific innovation could I find something that would be useful here? Are there like a few blanket solutions that just generally tend to work across the board because most organizations fail in the same ways, or is it like super specific?
If there's any way my new job relates to like doing FreakTakes or like stuff I do with Renaissance Philanthropy and Good Science Project, and my first job at U Chicago, it's that I feel like Steve Levitt, the Freakonomics economist who I worked with, would always say all sorts of stuff offhand. And he was like, he'd say them as generalizations. Really, he meant them with caveats, but you're like, you just say the generalized thing sometimes. But one of them that he would say is you can never convince anybody of anything, or people only want to work on their own ideas. And that's not always true. But as you get older, you're like, it's truer than I would have anticipated it to be. And so I think the reason I was willing to start the Substack is I thought people who set up these orgs often already adore places like early MIT or Bell Labs or GE Research. And my job can be as the selling them on it even more and then unpacking it to make it good, practical, useful for them. And so I guess when I show up to these calls, I really want to know what their inspirations are and what excites them. And then I say, okay, this is interesting. Let's latch on to that. Sometimes I think maybe they're a bit mistaken on the history of something. And if they say they like XYZ and therefore they like this organization, it's, maybe you're more Edison's research laboratory than GE Research or something of that sort. But I really try to let them take the lead. A, for the behavioral, like they've already decided what their inspirations are. Like, why will I fight them? And B, there's usually a touch of genius in these people. And they're very technically competent. And I don't really have those things. I view myself as providing a service to like people who are the geniuses of our time, the people like Adam Marblestone or something like that. So I don't think it's for me to say, no, that shouldn't be what excites you, your muse, the thing you want to model yourself after. I say, okay, I'll take what you're saying as gospel, like conditional on that. There's some stuff that near neighbor orgs from history who were very successful kept in mind that I think you should keep in mind. What's the best way to do this? Sometimes I will just send them a piece I've already written. Other times I'll say, let me write you a one-pager, and it'll distill 5 pieces of stuff and something very practical. And I guess to me, it's quite a dream gig, because in the very beginning, I thought, maybe like I'll get hired as like an ops person at the Arc Institute. And once a year, when they have some random question like this, they'll let me be the person who handles it. So the fact that I get to do it all the time is great.
I'm sure that any organization that you interface with feels very similarly, because who doesn't want that? Someone who goes in, like deeply examines this and tells you just, hey, here's this totally obvious thing that you could be doing better. Unless heads must roll or there's someone really on the other side of it, it's just a really awesome thing to know. Like I'm certainly appreciating it.
Oh yeah, and that's why talking to orgs that haven't started executing right yet is quite exciting. Because if they've already spent $10 million, like the answer might be like in the back of my head, I wouldn't have spent the money like that, but this person is like very excellent. I'm not. I maybe just don't see it, and I'm not good to advise on all sorts of this. And there's only some small thing. But in the very, very beginning, when the money's been allocated and no dollar has been spent, there's no more exciting time.
Yeah, maybe to segue into something, just because I listened actually to a new Freakonomics episode this morning, which was on Sludge, and it basically combined, it was mostly talking about like sludge in a general way, in the sense that there's just like a lot of bureaucratic sludge, which was defined there also as in opposition to nudge, which makes it much easier to do the right decision or the decision that afterwards you would have liked to have taken, thanks to Kastansin and co. But like sludge is this kind of like phenomenon where over time or like from the get-go, really, there's a lot of bureaucratic hurdles that you have to jump through, just like processes that are extremely hard, that are super costly, that are hidden. So that could be like filling out really long forms, making it really hard to unsubscribe to subscription model that you have. Some of them are on purpose, not all of them are. I was really like interested in that because you've also kind of written or at least alluded to the fact that it's not necessarily that progress is slowing down only because ideas are getting harder to find, but it's also that this kind of like bureaucracies are possibly getting just much more heavy, risk averse. So could you talk to that dynamic a little bit? And do you think, maybe we just start there, and then I have a question for you about like how that might develop in the future. But yeah, how do you think that organization or like that bureaucratic organizations slow down innovation today? And what are like some quick fixes that you'd recommend if you are such an organization, for example?
So I guess the theory you're getting at, which listeners can check out, is, what was it? Essentially, I wrote a piece. It ends in the burden of knowledge, the scientific slowdown, like math and physics divorce the burden of knowledge and the scientific slowdown. Essentially, it's people who read scientific history largely don't. They think a lot of the economists of innovation are maybe a bit too confident on like the burden of knowledge as the main driver of the scientific slowdown. Nobody's really arguing that it's harder to learn more facts than it is fewer. But what they would say is, so there's a lot of like scientists, like early progress studies folks, et cetera, who would note that like in mid-century physics or something of that sort, in the 1950s, like the average citation in the physical review was apparently like 18 months, and they were having to learn to cite letters and things of that sort. And this is 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years post like a lot of these early physics discoveries, where like a lot of people, if you were like purely following the burden of knowledge hypothesis, would say, it will only get harder. But it was their sense that like somebody like Gerald Holton, who I wrote a lot about, I would consider him one of the founding fathers of progress studies, like one of the people who helped found MIT STS. He was a physicist who became a historian of science, and he was a physicist in this like very dynamic era. And something he would say, and I think the oral history evidence from people like Warren Weaver, Richard Feynman, et cetera, like a lot of people who were greats for decades across that era would agree, is, we have this really good system of when we create new branches, the really young people are incentivized to hop on them at 24 and attempt to make their career. And in the same way that like in the Ben Jones burden of knowledge paper, they would look at like how bad our productivity per dollar or per research head is getting in something like corn per acre or in like transistor density or things of that sort. He shows a similar graph, and it's particle accelerator speed power. I forget which. And essentially it's log y-axis, and it's just a straight line. So it's going up exponentially, but then they have a separate graph where they break it down and they say what's happening. And it's all these new branches that are of technology that are exploding for 5 years and then curtailing. And in the same way that the people like economists of innovation who look at things like transistors or corn will be like, it's our sense this is just how this works. This is the most easily measurable one. Holton would say, you could say his theory fits within the burden of knowledge hypothesis, which would say it is harder to learn more facts rather than fewer, but that's within branches, and scientific branches, new branch creation and sustaining them as long as you can and using them to create more branches, like is what drives explosive scientific productivity growth. And so people like Holton, when he gives advice in the 1960s, it would be, he says, it's very clear, and to him, it's very clear the era of the department is over. everything's going to work like the MIT Rad Lab or something like that, where like maybe you have core fields, but like the research happens in integrated units and you keep spinning up new ones as it goes. And we're going to be very eager to give funds to people who are looking to hop on new branches, because that's where the exponential growth happens. We've seen precisely the opposite, because I guess post 1970s, 1980s, research has become a lot more bureaucratized in the US. And I talk more about this in the piece, how like the 1970s, like political movements, like things like Watergate and Vietnam, were a huge turning point, it seems, for the research ecosystem, just because like people began to have default mistrust in the government and things like that. And a lot of process just grows out of this mistrust, or how should we be? Like what should we be looking into? And all of those things. And so a lot of things start to get more bureaucratized, and then they're a little more rigid. The idea of the era of the department's over. We're just going to spin up new orgs. We're going to give money speculatively to 23-year-olds who like thought your weird paper that nobody understands what to make of. Instead of saying, oh, that's weird, there's 4 people at CMU who want to hop on it. And I think this is also something where when people read history, they're like, oh, just all 5 friends from grad school got like Harvard jobs. That would never happen today. Something to keep in mind is in a lot of those stories, what's happening is, oh, all those people were in iRabbi's lab and he had a really interesting piece of early technology. And like they put their whole career into saying, we think this is a huge deal. And that's where a lot of these like successes among people who are like professionally quite close come from. In terms of how to deal with bureaucracy, I don't have any special ideas on how to do something like come into the University of Chicago or come into MIT and say, hey, we have a lot of professors here that think things like FROs are fantastic. Like, how do we make it so we could run those out of they're a bit ossified. I'm not a bureaucracy hacker like somebody like Marina Nietzsche or something. So I guess in my work, what you'll notice is I do a lot of working with brand new organizations, or organizations that are philanthropically run and a few people have a really important say. Or, for example, so I've essentially ramped down my FreakTakes work from 80% of the time to, let's say, a third of my time. And I'm doing a lot of work at Renfill. Why am I doing that? Is because ARIA span up in the UK. I think they have very sensible procurement laws. And I had all this writing on early ARPA history saying, hey, I think it's great everybody wants to copy the early ARPA model, but let's be very clear. There are certain kinds of very ambitious and very applied contractors that could turn around like useful technology for you. JCR Licklider's team at BBN being one, the early CMU autonomous vehicle groups being another. And I think, to me, those are the teams that really make ARPA shine and are around for a lot of, if there's a few things from early ARPA history, like autonomous vehicles and the ARPANET, that make everybody want to copy the model or use some version of it that's different. Like ARIA is not ARPA, but they're similar. And like ARIA maybe what doesn't exist without early ARPA. Like I think you need to be willing to like fund brand new contractors that are willing to do BBN style work, where they're like, we're going to do stuff on the cutting edge, but we're not going to, people would leave places like the MIT Lincoln Laboratory or RAND because they were like, yeah, that's applied paper studies. We're engineers. We want to build stuff nobody's built before, like just fresh out of EE labs, or like maybe even too cutting edge for them, but we want to turn it around as practical prototypes for users. And this is an idea I had on the Substack, and I was willing to go work with ARIA because it's brand new. They have procurement laws that make a lot of sense. They're willing to fund young, bright 26-year-olds who serve a core need that they have. So I'm sorry that I don't have good answers on how do we fix them, and I tend to make career decisions based on who just doesn't have them and is fresh. And I can avoid it because me sitting on the podcast saying, oh, I think they should just tear up that rule is like a bit ignorant of like government processes and things of that sort. It's often more complicated, even if I wish it weren't. It is.
Okay, then let's go hyper fresh. If you were handed $100 million now to start up a private new organization from scratch, how would you organize it?
I think, okay, so in my day-to-day, I'll try to answer. In my day-to-day life, I try not to think about this because for the most part, I figure like I help the people who this happens to. It's maybe good to not have like too rigid an answer and to get to show up to everybody fresh and say, oh, they have a near neighbor from history, or like a few, and let's help them do that. But I guess, let's see, if I was going to do it, I guess if I were to say, what is the Substack? Are there themes the Substack talks a lot about that you're that you'd be uniquely useful at doing? One of my most popular pieces is on Warren Weaver and the early Rockefeller Foundation, and like how they more or less bootstrapped the field of molecular biology into existence. And it was because Weaver came around and he said, oh, wow, like I'm an applied mathematician. I saw what my field did, or I saw what, like, I'm an applied mathematician who works in physics. I saw what my field did for chemistry. And there was like that era where everybody in Silicon Valley seems to understand the physicists and chemists were winning each other's Nobel Prizes. He thought, I think the same thing could happen for biology. And in 1932, he was like, got offered an interview at the Rockefeller Foundation Natural Sciences Division. And he didn't think he'd be good at the job. He just went there to tell them, I think you guys should do this. And what went into the pitch is not just, I believe this area between physics and biology can be revolutionary, and that like the physics folks have come up with lots of tools and like models of thinking that are really good at the scale of the heredity problem specifically, because biology in this period was an organism level science. Like they had the microscope, but a lot of the physicists have gotten really good at working on a certain scale. And so they ended up thinking Warren Weaver was actually excellent. And when they brought him on, he had the bravery to do what I'm not sure any philanthropy I've seen, like any large philanthropy do in the modern era, which is like their natural sciences division said, he said, it's great. We have a lot of fantastic applicants who come to us. How this department has worked before me is they've sat down and people from zoology, electrical engineering, physics could come in and make a pitch. And we just say yes, no to the most exciting proposals. He said, that's fantastic, but nobody's above specialization. The Rockefeller company, which has like more money than God and funds this foundation, is not above specialization themselves. Like, I think we're essentially not using the money well by scattering it. And the implication was, we'll fund one area, it'll be super additive, and we're going to fund an area nobody else wants to fund. And that is what you saw out of him. So he starts putting 80% of the budget in 1932, 33. The field isn't even called molecular bio until 1937. And then around 1952-ish, when Watson and Crick make their discovery, they ramp all the money out of the fund and they put it, because they said everybody sees it now. The other funders will do it, and they put it into the next thing, which, why was he doing 80%, not 100%? There's random stuff that they wanted to be helpful for the whole time, but also when you look into it, you're like, oh, what's going on in those corners of the budget? It's like helping Vannevar Bush digitalize his differential analyzer, or like crop work. It's other big bets to where if they run into technical dead ends, it's very clear he's probably going to ramp those down. And like he saw computing and he skipped it because he said like the thing he changed to after the Watson and Crick discovery was, oh, miracle rice. Like he'd been dabbling with a lot of that stuff. And he thought, given everything they were learning in crop genetics, like given everything they were learning in molecular biology, they could apply it to crop genetics and things. And arguably creating molecular biology is like only Weaver's second most important contribution, because the Green Revolution is like, has all sorts of Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation paws all over it. So if I was going to do basic research with the 100 million, I would try to find some area that I thought put $100 million over 10 years or something could go a long way with that kind of thinking. But I think really what that would take is me saying, we're going to do it like this. I would like you, potential Warren Weavers, to come to me, and one of you will get these funds. And we're not going to have a bureaucratic foundation. It's going to be just you. We need to make sure that the area is scoped, so $100 million is maybe enough. And you'll get like 1 to 2 like technical staffers to help you run around and find really good people to fund. But that would be it on the basic research end. On the applied research end, I would do more of, if I said basic research makes me a little uncomfortable sometimes, just because I could imagine giving away the 100 million and nothing good coming of it, which is just like, I'm uncomfortable with. I think I'm maybe not I don't have the appropriate level of risk appetite to oversee that. So I would definitely need to find somebody else to do it. But on the applied research end, I have been doing all this writing on building more BBNs, and essentially just the very brief TLDR on what BBNs are is I was talking about all those early ARPA contractors that I think were responsible for like early autonomous vehicles or the ARPANET. What do I think these organizations have that make them pretty dissimilar to existing R&D contractors today, like a Raytheon or Charles River or something, as well as academic labs? So to me, there's 3 pillars that make a BBN. The first one is they're exceptionally novelty seeking or technically ambitious. I think a lot of academic labs have that. It's like an FRO style technical vision. I don't think places like Charles River or Raytheon necessarily have teams with a Henry Lee or somebody like that walking around who have some technical vision that nobody thinks is possible.
You might even briefly have to say what a BBN is.
Oh, sorry. So where does the BBN acronym come from? It comes from BBN was the main ARPANET contractor. The name is Bolt, Beranek, and Newman. It was essentially a firm that spun out of MIT. It'll be famous to Silicon Valley folks for, this is where JCR Licklider left MIT to join. And this is what BBN was. Like, there's all sorts of interesting testimonials from the MIT professors at the time where they call BBN like the cognac of the research business, or like a hyped up version of Harvard and MIT, but where you don't have to teach classes. And the reason is you have people like JCR Licklider joining, who they joined it because they had a technical ambition and the university wasn't the appropriate place to pursue it. Because it would often be too systems engineering focused, or you had to turn around a product for an actual customer. So like when Licklider joins BBN, he says, I want to build I would like to build interactive computers. To do that, there's clearly two technical areas we need to focus on. We need to work on real-time computing, because computing was in a batch processing paradigm. And we need to work on all sorts of UX improvements. And really, a BBN in its own way pursues an FRO style technical vision with a mix of contracts and grants. And so with those things in mind, Licklider convinces BBN to buy a big computer for him. He actually got him to buy two. And then he said, okay, let's go sell some contracts. And he did it not saying, let's revenue maximize, like we want to be the most profitable consulting firm possible. He said, this is just an applied lab. Contracts and grants are like the thing that pays the bills. And so they go down to the person who runs the NIH Clinical Center, and they essentially convince this person that hospital administrative records in the early 1960s, they did this, are clearly going to be computerized at some point. Let us build you the first system now. And they didn't do this because they actually wanted, the BBN folks didn't care about like electronic medical records being digitized. What they saw was the opportunity to fund a novel technical system and like all sorts of engineering iteration cycles at a break-even, slightly profitable way. And they do this throughout the 1960s, which is very relevant. And very relevant because by the time the ARPANET contract comes from like ARPA and the people over there, they've already been de-risking this technology for 5 or 6 years. And so when the ARPANET contract comes and they say, oh, we want people to build us these IMPs, essentially these computers that connect to bigger computers, it's this real-time computing problem. And this is the one group that's been de-risking this. And by the time the money left the ARPA account, the first nodes of the ARPANET were delivered and functional within 9 months, and on budget too. And so this is the kind of thing they're working on where you're like, oh, that's not really a university problem. And I think I won't bore people with the CMU autonomous vehicle story, but like essentially CMU also had a pretty similar founding story, but in a nonprofit setting instead of a firm setting. And I think this is very exciting for engineering adjacent fields. So I can imagine the number one thing I would do, even more than, I think I'm not as great as Warren Weaver. If I could find a Warren Weaver, maybe I would reconsider and do that. I would set up shop with the $100 million and I'd say, I will wholly seed fund BBNs, or would be BBNs that want to service some ambitious area of R&D. Is it because an area of research needs a systems engineer, testbed technology, like a group to tie it all together and make it workable, expand the ambitions of the field, whatever it is? Or do you just want to service a field and you think it could be 10 times as productive if they had some group that serving a non-VC market? And I think there's all sorts of, we're talking about the ARPANET and autonomous vehicles. You could imagine life sciences CROs with a risk capital budget to do really ambitious stuff or staple longer strands of DNA together. And you can imagine it in the social sciences. I think there's been a lot of things in, like, me and Adam Marbleson have talked about economic complexity and how people don't seem to be operationalizing that work because there's not really a VC market, but it's very exciting. And I was talking to a cognitive scientist the other day who was essentially explaining to me how all these different cognitive scientists will write papers essentially guessing at like how our brain, for something like mechanics, or like how's a ball going to flow in this simulation, like what simplifications is our brain using? People have different competing theories. Is the appropriate thing to mix them, yada, yada. The field is like in the same way that people would leave Lincoln Labs because you're like, oh, it's an applied paper study. You can imagine a world where if somebody wanted to seed at $2, $3, $4 million, some group saying, oh, we're going to take all that literature and try to like mix the models appropriately and figure out like technology to apply everything they're learning accurately and also give them like good feedback cycles. I don't know if that's where I'd put the $2 million, but if I was obsessed with that field, like the fact that the MIT Minds, Brains, and Sciences groups don't have like test bed technology builders is the kind of thing a BBN could address. So I'm sure we would run out of money before we ran out of good ideas from like very excited postdocs with engineering focuses. So I think a lot about BBNs too. If anybody here is listening and says, I think I have a BBN, the reason I've gone on board to Renphyl and I'm doing less research work is with ARIA, we're trying to help them build BBNs to service their portfolio. And I also want to do it in America and elsewhere too. And finding great founders is the first step. Like, I'm not a genius. I'm not you all. Like, I want to help the geniuses of my time. So if you all have ideas, please email me at gilliam@renphyl.org.
But you wouldn't want to, let's say, constrain it to a specific area within you're specifically interested in these people.
I would consider it. I think specialization is big. If I was going to specialize, what I could imagine is taking 50 million of the dollars, 60 million of the dollars, and putting them to the side and saying those are funds that get spent from year 4 onward. We're just going to invest them in bonds for now or something. And then going in and saying, we're going to invest in you all. This is like this stage of the program, the first 4 years is the like 20% side bets in Weaver's portfolio or something. We're looking for the thing we want to dump $60 million on. We're not confident in it yet. So let's like seed a few of these and we'll see how it goes. And to me, I think it would just be very exciting to just, you could just imagine having a life sciences version where you just have a building in Cambridge, MA of, I don't know what they'd be doing. Like you can imagine embedding them in life sciences labs. You can imagine them like going around and figuring out a few common areas and working together and like partnering with the labs. Like, I don't know precisely the way it would work for each area. It would depend on what you got pitched and the vision of the person, but it's the kind of thing where this is not just early ARPA informing this learning. Like for readers of the Substack, they also know I'm obsessed with early MIT. And early MIT was very committed to, we serve industry above all else. And like the early applied chemistry department at MIT, like at one point during something called the technology plan, where they said, oh, MIT's kind of broke. This isn't going well. There's nothing more productive an Institute of Applied Technology can do than apply its services at a reasonable cost. Like we would now know the applied chemistry department as like a chemi department. And they essentially helped create the modern field of chemical engineering, like through their contracts and some of the basic research going on there at the time. And that, when we think of MIT's great World War II contributions, what's important to remember is that was the MIT that was contracting with the government. And it was in the process of changing, because in that mid-century period, industrial R&D labs were becoming more and more common. So the thought of MIT being like, hey, 75% industry contracts is kind of a lot. Maybe this is not the good balance. Maybe something like 50-50 or less or whatever. And also the people at GE Research, DuPont, Bell Labs, a lot of small R&D labs at the time too, hundreds, I think. There are more and more PhDs or like good MIT undergrads working at these places. We could take a step back. Like what it means to be applied is we want to work at things up until they're right on the doorstep of industry. Like they don't need venture funding or things like that. But since industry is getting more basic research focused, like we ourselves should also be a bit more basic research focused. So MIT was in the process of just recently having been the group that was willing to do stuff like have 80% of their department be industry contract funded, and bringing in like a Princeton, like Compton, who was to be president, who was a Princeton physics department head, which is Princeton's always been pretty basic research focused, but also he was one of GE's best physics contractors. So like they thought, oh, maybe this is the person who could shepherd us into that era. But I think all sorts of the most exciting things that happened in the 20th century that we can think of came out of this applied contracting. Like servo mechanisms would be one, for example, that would have come out of that era of MIT. And I don't think we'd get servo mechanisms out of MIT today.
So it wouldn't really be reforming MIT, it would be building a new one.
I know, not building a new one. So I think MIT is still MIT's changed. It's the world's best at this thing it does though. But it's right now, a person can say, do I go to MIT, Harvard, or Stanford, or like MIT or Harvard to make it simpler? And you go, oh, that's tough. There used to be such differentiated offerings that it was like, if you were like from a Harvard, like rich Harvard family in Boston, they would like consider having like an intervention to be like, you're going to go to the factory people. What are you doing? Like in its early years, MIT was a place that said, you're going to be like a factory foreman who knows science. Is like that. And that's how you solve problems, is you like have a scientific background and be handy. So while I think it's hard to like reform MIT today, the reason BBNs are so exciting to me is I think MIT is still this fantastic top of funnel for like great applied research ideas. But I think there's all sorts of contracts they won't do today. I think there's all sorts of technologies that are pretty applied and not novel in the way academia would like them to be. Like you're maybe like spending your time reducing error rates to like something like the ARPANET, you need it to be a utility. Like that needs to have an uptime of 98 or 99%. And MIT very likely would say, oh, we got it to work once or in this context. Like, why do we need to make it smaller, like to work 99%? And you could raise an FRO around it, but it's just often hard to raise 15, $20 million. It's a lot of money. It's maybe like one of the meta science miracles of the past 5 or 10 years that we figured out a way to make it start happening and start building this case that like the NIH or NSF should be doing this. But I think a lot of BBNs really might only need $500,000, $1 million upfront and like some warm introductions to customers or things like that. And I think it, in a way, if more of them existed, you can look at it as recreating old MIT in the aggregate, at least in all sorts of areas. And that's why I think about them, is I don't want to be in the business of competing with MIT. If I can't convince them to do this thing that they used to do that I loved, well, maybe you could bolt it on and like even set them up in Cambridge or somewhere else too, somewhere cheaper like Pittsburgh.
It does seem like it was a pretty magical place, especially like back in the day. I know that like, for example, our founders, Eric Drexler and Christine Peterson, I think met at MIT, or at least had the idea for starting Foresight while they were at MIT. And just hearing the old stories from the archive are like, just seems like absolutely magical, wonderful time. But I'll leave it at that. I have so many more questions. You have no idea. But I'll hand it over to Beatrice because we need to dive into some of the more future-directed existential hope part of the interview too. But that was wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, great. And no matter what, I will potentially tie history stories. And I guess I think about the future by thinking a lot about the past. So
I love that. So that's great. In general, just inspiring to see someone be able to use historical studies for this like type of applied things. It's just good that someone is doing it, basically. But okay, so the first thing that I want to ask you is, I think one of the things that you've already mentioned a little bit in this conversation is this idea of like branches, new branches, I think, or like branch finding. So context of existential hope, do you think there are any like new and exciting branches of like science and technology that you're seeing right now, or that you'd like to see come in the future, like near-term future?
I guess this is one of those where I'm probably not a good person to ask, because I want to talk to people who think there's a branch somewhere, but I'm really just, as I said, like I couldn't even see physics through like the first course or two during undergrad, or I did my computer science, but I was like just struggling to keep up. So it's one of those things where when people come to me with an idea, sometimes I trust them, very often I run them by somebody who I think like I've at least vetted as operationally competent in the area. We both speak the same language. I think they're very good. And I'll ask, so I'm a bad person to ask. What I would say is if anybody thinks there are certain commonalities in new branches, and very often new branches use some existing breakthrough and combine it to a new field. If you were to say, what do a ton of new branches have in common? Like what Warren Weaver was doing with molecular biology at the Rockefeller Foundation is saying, we have new modes of thinking and new instruments that we've used to attack physics at this like very small scale that the biologists as like a microscope level science have not necessarily been thinking about. Let's apply that to biological problems. Here's why I think it could apply. So I think problems of that shape are always very exciting to me, because we've figured out a lot of the stuff and it also makes sense why we haven't necessarily applied them yet. And this is also why, while I do think it seems like when I talk to folks in Cambridge, Massachusetts, they have a lot less faith that scale, even like the ones who have worked in AI and things like that, they seem to have a lot less faith that scale will solve all sorts of problems their labs work on. And so I think sometimes the West Coast I'm very much a fan of AI. Only when I'm in like Berkeley or SF do I feel like I'm like bearish or something, because I feel like people there are big fans. But I think they're right in saying we've made this new breakthrough. It makes sense that we should just start applying it wherever it fits in this new field. And so I am generally excited by that. And also, even if I don't trust myself, even if you go back to the 1940s, like Warren Weaver has an essay on like science and complexity, where essentially biology is this fascinating problem of organized complexity. That was one of the reasons he was fascinated by computers. He said, computers are fantastic at modeling this kind of thing. I think we're going to see a century of biology, of life sciences work built on computers that are really good at modeling problems of organized complexity. So I think all sorts of things like applying computing to the life sciences is exciting. I think saying, and the tool will work off the shelf, is historically it's tough. So I think there's a lot of bespoke work to do, or potentially I could imagine BBNs for if one was going to specialize, you could say you're going to be the BBN for every for every area of the life sciences, and you all are going to do the 5 years of work to find ways to make the off-the-shelf CS models as productive as possible. We know it's hard for you all to keep software engineers in the lab or things of that sort, but I don't have any special ideas myself. This is essentially me saying, I'm very excited about computers and biology. I'm sympathetic to the folks in Cambridge MA who are like, we're excited too, so why we use them, but we think some bespoke work is needed. That's the shape of stuff that's exciting. But also, I think there's all sorts of other exciting ideas too. Like early information theory, I think is one I don't think I have a good mental model to have caught. But I guess one could say, oh, that's also the same. You took Boolean algebra from philosophy and you applied it to this practical problem. But there's all sorts of ways to come up with like strokes of genius on what could be a new branch. I think I have a lot of opinions on how we should restructure scientific funding systems to make sure those people get funding. I don't have good opinions on how do we know. I think we just have to be willing to actually go 0 for 20 every so often, with the understanding that like funding information theory once is worth something in the tens or hundreds of billions.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer, certainly. And I think AI for X is something we've talked a lot about lately at Foresight. Like we have an AI for Bio workshop coming up, I think in just a few weeks now. And it's also something that I think Tom Khalil, who you work with at Renaissance, he spoke about at Vision Weekend last year, I think it was, where he spoke about basically like how AI for Bio, like protein fold, like the alpha protein, how that was like a really good case of using AI for bio, and like how it's a recommended listen, I think, for people. It's on YouTube and it's just 10 minutes basically.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, and so another thing that I wanted to check in with you about that I know is like a recurring theme in your writing is this idea of, which is very big for us at Existential Hope, I would say, is like, why are we doing this? Kind of like, why are we working to advance all these like science and technology? And for you, I think one thing that I've seen as like recurring is that you say that it should be measured by its success on like human well-being, basically. Could you break that down a little, both in terms of what do you have ideas for what that could mean in terms of human well-being? What is that practically?
Okay.
And also, how can we do that? Do you have any ideas, or have you seen anyone do this well before?
Okay. So I'm just jotting down. So the first piece I ever wrote for the Substack, which nobody reads, because I think they like me in my bucket as applied history boy, which I think is like, fine, that's the service I provide. But to me, it's the reason why I write the Substack is, I don't know if you guys are going to ask me about 2 books, but like I've already spoken about, I think it would be fantastic for people to read The Making of the Atomic Bomb, because it was an exciting book. I think some people think science is boring, but scientists are interesting to the point of sitcom characters. Like, I think it's fantastic. But there's another book that I think really gets at why do we do this? Why is this worth doing? And I think Robert Gordon's arguments in Rise and Fall of American Growth would charm me to spend my time on this. I'm like reflexively drawn to this because I like scientists and I like science, but the reason I could justify continuing to stay, whereas I guess in my old life, I would like I started an EA adjacent charity. Like, why can I justify being here beyond just liking it? Is in Rise and Fall of American Growth, I think Gordon does a really good job of saying, yeah, TFP, TFP, TFP. But what does it even mean when you're like $2,000 of spending power 10 years ago? I'd be homeless now. They're not homeless.
What does TFP mean? Sorry.
Total factor productivity, like just people who like obsess over productivity measurements. And Gordon does an exceptional job of being like, here's the TFP growth. That means nothing to you all. We're going to talk about like when the washing machine came around, I'm going to tell you like the mother in the house, the sisters, how their days were spent before that and after that. And like how hard it was to wash clothes and like getting 8 or 10 hours a week back in your life of not just not having to do that, but this was terrible. Like carrying buckets 100 yards and going back. It was just like this whole day of backbreaking labor. And he's just, this is what's baked into those numbers. And he does a really good job of that. And so I guess in the first piece where I make the argument more coherently and summarize it, like there are, I think, practical to-dos that would come out of something like Robert Gordon's book. And it's something like, how do we help people buy more housing or more food or live longer? And there's like a fourth and a fifth. Like it seems like there's all sorts of things that happen in Silicon Valley world that like we have this fixed amount of screen time we spend or like leisure, or like how do we increase the amount of leisure time would be like another Robert Gordon one. I think it seems like a lot of things that like maybe VCs fund because they're profitable are often about like, we have some fixed amount of leisure time. Like, how do we make it better would be like what Netflix's addressable market is. But to me, what's really exciting about funding scientific R&D is not, because it's cool. I think understanding things is great. But the concept of like, how do we help 6 hours of sleep feel like 8 hours of sleep, or buy more food for less money, or more housing, or live longer? Like, I think the longevity people have it right. To me, that's an area worth burning $100 billion on until we like find something exciting. So it's those types of questions that are, to me, very exciting. But I think also like there's nothing wrong with working on something because it's cool and you could find funds to cover it. I think in so many ways, like scientific history is driven by nerds who were just obsessed with something. The Wright brothers wanted a glider. Wilbur Wright had like exceptional taste and he wanted to make the glider. He thought it was beautiful. Orville wanted a car, like to build a car and an engine, because that's what the tinkery people in Dayton was an invention hotbed at the time. We're working on, and Orville was just like, oh, it's crass. Or Wilbur was like, it's crass, it's loud, it's disgusting. Like this thing we're making is beautiful. And that's what they wanted to do. They even turned down funds just so they can continue working on it themselves. Like I think a nerd with an ambition that they happen to be able to fund themselves is a beautiful thing all on its own. But I do hope that if that's the top of funnel, that some amount of it is improving lives in those Robert Gordon-esque, very practical ways.
That's great. It's a good reminder of the grim old days, I think. And so if you think about all this work and the futures that it can enable, do you have a favorite vision of the future that like really excites you? If I ask you, Eric, what's your like existential hope vision of the future? What would your answer be?
So this is one of those questions that I don't think about a lot because I don't think I fancy myself as any kind of visionary. But I guess when I look backward and I see all the great, I often look backward at something like a really great basic research funder like the Rockefeller Foundation and Warren Weaver, or great applied research shops like early MIT or like BBN, which gave us the ARPANET, or CMU Autonomous Vehicle Groups. I think, oh, wow. Sometimes history gets rid of things for very arbitrary reasons, like universities just decide, like the NIH is funding more stuff, universities decide to specialize in that. You get bigger and more bureaucratic, it's hard to respond. I think about the future oftentimes by looking backwards and saying, maybe what do we get rid of that didn't make a lot of sense? Is there a practical way to bring it back so the visionaries of our time who do think about questions like the one you're asking and have a very clear vision in one way or another, have an additional perch from which to pursue their technical ambition? So I think, wow, how do I get 50 BBNs set up in Cambridge MA and 20 in SF and 5 around Carnegie Mellon? And what can those people do to change the future? And how can I make it so, let's say, right now, maybe if all things go well with ARIA, maybe we can help spin up 2 or 3 BBNs a year with them. If these are all organizational experiments, if that goes well, how can I make it so 5 years from now we have 10 total? And 10 years from now, there's 50. I guess that's the step I think about. And I hope that people with more vision for the future can use those positions to do a lot more. Maybe I could be a little footnote in their memoir history book or something.
Yeah, I think also just we can advise people to read your FreakTake Substack. Do you have any, like, I think that's very inspirational, or looking back at history is inspirational also for the future, like we've said a few times now. But do you have any favorite, if you were to recommend people to, they're going to read one article to see if they like your Substack, which one would you recommend?
Okay, can I give 2 or 3, but like categories? So like you all only have to read one of these. If you're obsessed with basic research and how we do basic research more ambitiously, there's one called A Report on Scientific Branch Creation, How the Rockefeller Foundation Bootstrapped the Field of Molecular Biology. That's the story of Warren Weaver, the Rockefeller Foundation. I look into all the budgets, where his thesis came from, how he did what he did. If you're somebody who's been compelled by the vision of BBNs I've talked about today, and you think that's exciting, you want to do that yourself, I have a piece called, I don't remember what I call them. I picked the titles at the end. Essentially, it's a scrappy complement to FROs building more BBNs. And in there, I synthesize pieces on other BBNs. And if you just think these stories about applied research are awesome, I have a progress studies history of early MIT, where part 1 is the ethos of the place. Part 2 is their approach to applied research. And people seem to really like that. And before I wrote it, I thought, the MIT people are going to be mad at me. But I've had, I don't know, coming up on maybe 100 different like MIT people be like, yeah, I wish it was, that's what I thought it would be. That's not what the place is anymore. MIT is the best in the world at what it does, but they're not the kind of place I describe in part 1. And so I think a lot of early MIT and like the different life cycles of MIT inform a lot of advice I give to people in different things, because it really just was this bastion of applied American innovation for like in a certain way for 100 years, and it still is in a pretty different way, in a way that's more similar to Harvard or Stanford today.
And do you feel hopeful that we're moving in the right direction? Do you see things getting better, like overall for the whole like progress field, or is
Yeah. So I talked to I did an interview for Asimov Press with Alon Gur. I don't know which of these will come out first, but somebody like Alon Gur has been in this, I guess you can call it the applied metascience field for so long, for so much of his career. And it seems like it's not lonely anymore. Like maybe we're in the era where you have to be pretty entrepreneurial or like network pretty well, which is limiting. There's all sorts of people who get left out. Like, for example, I live in the Midwest. I don't think any of the good engineers at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign or Purdue maybe think about this or know these options exist to them. But all of a sudden it's, oh, if you're really entrepreneurial, you can get your way into it and there's next steps. And maybe you can get a Foresight Institute grant and you like pitch them a vision, where I think it used to be the number of things you can do and the number of people granting this or thinking about this we're so much smaller. So I do think things are getting better. And also, even if none of this applied metascience stuff was going on, which is very exciting, I love it. Like, I think a lot of times the American R&D bureaucracy still like they often make quite good decisions in a vacuum. It's just, I think over time they get a bit sclerotic or have a lot of rules or things like that. But it's easy for somebody like me or like to think about all the things the NIH doesn't do. But when you start looking at all these other countries, like I'm often like, when you look at like different European countries' R&D budgets, I guess I start to feel very thankful that Americans do think it's like a no-brainer for the most part. Like administrations get weird to spend $40-50 billion a year on something like the NIH or $8-10 billion a year at the NSF. So I think it's also good to be thankful about what we have, but conditional on that, I do constantly every day like look back at the history and then like in my head complain a little bit about something they got rid of that I think was dumb, and I want to like scheme a way to bring it back.
We've reached the last minute that we have together, so I'll just ask you one last question. I'll also just say that I think we should list, I think there are a lot of, like you said, it's not so lonely anymore to be interested in metascience, so that's actually really nice. And we'll link a bunch of these recommended resources also to the episode. But my last question is just, what's the best piece of advice you ever received?
I guess as the way my brain works, I think I don't bake in individual pieces of advice and like fully come to terms with maybe how much impact they had on me. So I guess I'm not sure I have a good answer to that. But I think of my mentors a little bit as the people I read in the books too. So there's like random things Steve Levitt used to say, he's alive, but there's also, I don't know, there's a lot of minor things that really get to me from the books I read because initially, now I do this professionally, but in the beginning, I read these biographies and I wanted to be their friend. And that was what got me into it. And I guess at the top of the list, somebody who I constantly go back to their writing, I'd like to write a book about them one day when I find the time, is just, I think Warren Weaver was a great person for the most part. And he's very down to earth and I don't know. I think he approached the field of scientific philanthropy and he was going for big hits, big wins. And there's like a certain Silicon Valley bravado that often goes along with people who do that today. He was just the most down to earth Midwestern guy. And like, to me, there's just all sorts of ways he approaches problems and humbleness with dealing with things day to day that I think rubs off on me. It's also a part of the reason I live in the Midwest now. I stay here. It's not that this is a professionally useful place. I think there's a lot of the down to earth nature of the place. I'm very open to rubbing off on me. Like I'm very ambitious in all sorts of my professional endeavors and surround myself with people like that. Like I like being in this place where I think people have their priorities straight. And I don't know. I think it's nice to see somebody who did things at the highest level also bringing that approach to it. And I know that wasn't an answer, but if anybody is watching, Scene of Change, A Lifetime in American Science is also a very good book. And if you know anybody at Simon and Schuster, or is it Penguin owns Simon? Whoever owns Simon and Schuster now, or Simon and Schuster, let them know. I'd love to buy the IP rights to the book. They won't email me back. Because they won't print it. I just want to print it so people could have it. Sometimes it's like $100 for a copy.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I think if I was to sum that up, it sounds like your advice would be like find good role models and read good books, basically.
Yeah. But baked into that is I'm a deep believer in the mentorship model. So find a way to get a good mentor or pick up a good book and try to understand how that person's brain worked. A lot of great people have lived before and a lot of them are dead now, but they used to write stuff down at quite a high rate.
Yeah. That's even impressively so for the last few thousand years. So that's great.
Yeah.
That's all we have time for. But thank you so much, Eric. This was really interesting. I've learned very much in this interview. Thank you.